Tov, today's daf yomi is Sanhedrin Pei Vav, Sanhedrin 86. Today's daf is dedicated for a shmir for the Chayalim and so for the Shvuyim and the Yeshua for Am Yisrael on this Eis Tzara. We're going to start on the bottom of Pei Heyam Abayz, 2 lines from the bottom. The Gemara is discussing that you get chenek, you get strangulation for kidnapping somebody, but the only way you get strangulation is if you kidnap him, use him, and then sell him. So the Gemara says the following: Macharo Aviv, the last line of it, pay him a base. Let's say you sell him to your father, or Ola Echav and Akrovim. Let's say you sell him to your father or your brother or one of your relatives, you're still going to be liable. Chayav. Hagonev, meaning to say we sell him to not to your father, not to the thief's father, but the father of the one from whom the slave was stolen, or the father of the from whom the person was stolen. Agonis avadim, somebody who steals a slave, potter is exempt. And now the Gemara on the top of 86a says, Tani Tana Kamed Rav Sheshes, and Tana taught this brisa in front of Rav Sheshes, and the brisa said, one who sells it to the father of the person from whom you stole, he's liable. And Rav Sheshes said, Amarle ani shoneh Rabbi Shimon Omer me'achav ad shiotzienu mirishus achav va'at omeret chayev. I learn that he's only liable once you take it out of the domain of his brother, and you say that he is chayev, meaning say you're not saying it consistent with Rabbi Shimon. So Tani Potter, Rav Sheshes says, no, you have to say not that he's liable if he steals it from the person's father or brother, but that he's Potter. Mara says, my kushya, why is this a difficulty? Why don't we just say Dilma ha Rabbi Shimon ha Rabbanan? Why don't we just say it's a dispute between Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan, whether Rabbi Shimon says you're Potter and the Rabbanan say you're liable. So the Mara says, no, lo saka da'itach. We don't want to say that. No, Rabbi Yochanan stam masnisa Rabbi Meir, stam tosef to Rabbi Nechem, because Rabbi Yochanan taught anonymous Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, and anonymous tosef is Rabbi Nechemia, stam sifra is Rabbi Yehuda. Anonymous Sifra is Rabbi Yehuda, and a Stam Sifrei, which comes from Devarim, is Rabbi Shimon. Vikul, Ibad Rabbi Akiva, and all of them were students of Rabbi Akiva, so all of them are quoting from Rabbi Akiva. So we see from here that Rabbi Shimon was the author of this brisa, and so therefore we have to change the brisa to say that it's exempt if he steals it from his father, if he steals it and then sells it to the father or brother of the one who was robbed. So now we say Agone Espino, one who steals his son, Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, says he is liable, and the Chum say you're exempt. So one who kidnaps his son, my time of the Rabbanan, what's the reason why the Rabbanan say you're exempt? Amar Abai, Amar Kra, because the pasuk says ki yimatzei. If you find a person, ki yimatzei ish gonev nefesh me'achav, meaning to say if you find somebody. And so we see from here, this doesn't apply to somebody who's in your domain already. So Amar Abai, so Amar Rav Papa Abai, so Rav Papa says to Abai, well, would you say the same thing by adultery? Amar El Me'ata Ki Matzei Ish Shochevim Isha Bulas Baal. Would you say that adultery doesn't apply because she was, if you're living in the proximity of a married woman, then it doesn't apply because it's not a person, a woman who you came upon or found. Hachanami Ki Matzei Prata Matzoi. Would you say they're exempt? Amarle, no. So Abai says, I didn't learn that from Kimatze. I learned it out. From it was in his domain, meaning to say it's extra. And so therefore, this person is under his household, so to speak. Not that he's in proximity. Amarava Helka Hani Mikri the Dardaki. So therefore, Rava says these people who teach children Torah or those who teach Rabbanon, they're not going to be liable for kidnapping them because they're in the domain and therefore they're exempt. So now the Mishnah had said, if you steal someone who's a half slave and half free, that's a dispute. Rabbi Yehuda says you're liable, and the Chachamim say you're exempt. But now the Gemara compares this to a case in Baba Kama, Tanan Hasam, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein lavadim boshes, that if you embarrass an Evet Kanani, you don't have to pay humiliation fees. My time with Rabbi Yehuda. What's the basis for Rabbi Yehuda? It's based upon the pasuk. Amar Kra, it says in the pasuk in Deuteronomy, Ki notzu anoshim yachdav ish ve'echav. When two men are fighting together, and then you embarrass them, then you have to pay humiliation. But that implies Misha Yeshlo Achva. It only points to somebody who has a brother. Yotza Eved, Shelo Achva, a Canaanite slave does not have any lineage, so he doesn't have a brother. And so therefore, Rabbi Yehuda would say, under these circumstances, so why is he liable? We'll have to see why in a moment. Rabbanan Achav Huba Mitzvos. Rabbanan say he is your brother with mitzvos. V'hacha. So there, in that case, Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that you don't have to pay the humiliation because he doesn't have lineage. And the Rabbanan say you're liable there for humiliation because he is your brother in mitzvos, because the Emet Kanani does do certain mitzvos. So here in our case, where Rabbi Yehuda says that you're going to be, in the case of Chatzi Ben Chorin, Rabbi Yehuda said you're liable. What's his drasha? So the Gemara says, Savar. So Rabbi Yehuda said the position that when it says in the pasuk, it says Kimatze ish gonim nefesh me'achav. That comes to exclude afukei avodim, to exclude slaves. And then it says in the pasuk Bnei Yisrael miutim misha chatzu ever v'chatzu ben chorin. The next phrase comes to exclude somebody who's half slave and half free. But this is a miut achar miut. It's an exclusion after an exclusion, and we have a concept a miut achar miut el rabos. Whenever you have an exclusion after an exclusion, it comes to include. And so therefore, in this case, it's including that you're liable for a half slave, half free. So says the Gemara, the Rabbanan, how come the Rabbanan say you're potter if it's Chatzi Ever, Chatzi Ben Koren? It says Me'achav Lafukei Avadim. When it says you steal someone from your brothers, that excludes slaves. So he says, Lo Mashmo. That's not the correct implication. That's not the correct implication. Because he is your brother in mitzvos. And when it says Mi B'nai Yisrael, it says Mi B'nai Yisrael, Mi B'nai Yisrael. It says it twice. It says in the pasuk, B'nai Yisrael and Mi B'nai Yisrael, because they expound the extra mem to say it's an extra teaching of the words B'nai Yisrael. And so therefore, Chaylu Miuti Eved, one excludes the slave, one excludes one who's half slave, half free. So now the Gemara tells us, where is in the Torah does it say you're not allowed to kidnap somebody? And if he says it comes from the Ten Commandments where it says you shall not steal. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Milo Yimkaru Mimkaras Eved. It says that you're not allowed to sell the slave. It says Kilo Yimkaru Mimkaras Eved. It says that with respect to that Hebrew slave who goes out in Jubilee year, you're not allowed to sell him forever. So you see from here, you're also not allowed to kidnap here. But they're actually not arguing. One is considering the prohibition of theft. That's the position of Rebbe Yoshaya. And the other one is counting the prohibition of sale, and that's the position of Rebbe Yochanan. So now the Gemara tells us, when the pasuk says you know how to steal, that refers to gonim nefashos. That refers to somebody who steals a human being. I told Meir, but gonim nefashos, when the Ten Commandments says do not steal, is it really referring to kidnapping? Or maybe the Ten Commandments says you know how to steal money. So the Gemara says, Amr Tzeu Amad Mishlosh Esrei Midosh Atorah Yoshben. We say go and derive it from the 13 attributes that the Torah is expounded upon. Good morning, Jeff. We're on 86a, around 10 lines from the bottom. The Ten Commandments says do not steal. So the Gemara is saying that when the Ten Commandments says do not steal, it doesn't mean do not steal. It means do not kidnap a person. So the Gemara is asking, how do we know that it means do not kidnap? Maybe it means don't steal. So the Gemara says, we learn it out from the 13 attributes that the Torah is expounded. We say, Davar, one of them is Davar Alome Minyano. We learn out one of the basic ways to derive from the Torah is you have to look at the context. Bama Kosam and Davar, the 10 Commandments, what are they referring to? They're referring to capital crime, Benefashos. So Avkam Benefashos. It's referring to a capital crime. Do not steal. And it doesn't mean do not steal money. It means do not kidnap. Tanya Idach. So the other brayta says, Lo tignovu. When it says do not steal, Begone mamon akasad medaber. When it says later on in Parshas Kedoshim, do not steal there, it doesn't refer to kidnapping there, it refers to stealing money. I tell him there, begone mamon, is that really stealing money? Or maybe it is referring to kidnapping. So Amr Seo Mamishloshem Shatur Trustman Daryl Mamino Bamal Medaber Mamon. So here too look at the context. What's the context here? The context here is in Kedoshim, it's prohibitions, not capital crimes. There's love, and there it's referring to money, so therefore we say it's a monetary theft. Now the Gemara says the concept here, a little bit tricky, it brings us a review, but also looking forward to Makos. It says, Imar Ede Geneva ve'Ede Mechira B'nefesh Shohuzmu. So again, we've said that in order to be liable for kidnapping, you have to kidnap the person, use him, and sell him. And so therefore, you have two witnesses to the theft and two witnesses to the sale. That's the only way you're liable for death, if you kidnap and then sell. And now the witnesses come along and they impeach, two other witnesses come along and impeach the other witnesses. So Chizkiah says, Ein Haragin. Chizkiah says the witnesses who are impeached are not killed, even though the person would be killed as a result of their testimony. Chizkiah says in this case they're not killed. Rabbi Yochanan says Haragin. Rabbi Yochanan says no, the false witnesses are killed. Chizkiah, why does he say they're not killed? Because he holds like Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, and this is something we had earlier in our Masechta as well, that it says the Amar Rabbi Akiva says, we had it back on Daf Lamed, if you remember, 50 days ago or 60 days ago, that Rabbi Akiva says davar vo chatzi davar. Rabbi Akiva says that the witnesses, in order to be liable, have to give the entire testimony and not just half the testimony. And so therefore, in this case, they won't be sentenced to that. We don't impeach them and make them liable for death. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Karabanan, Amar Davar Vafil Chatzi Davar, says even if they just testify, half of their testimony is responsible for him going to death. The Rabbanan say he's going to be put to death. So that's the fundamental teaching. So now the Gemara tells us, but Chizkiah himself will admit that they would be liable. So what's the rebellious child? In order for a person to be sentenced to death, first you need two set witnesses to say he violated the stealing twice, so he gets lashes twice, and then the third time you have the sets of witnesses that say that he did it again, and then we put him to death. So if the last set of witnesses testify that he did this theft of the meat and the wine, and they're impeached, even Chizkiah would say that they are killed. Why? Because the witnesses could say, Harishonim lal koso banu. Because the witnesses could say, Harishonim, we just came lal koso banu. The first witnesses could say, we just came to give him lashes, or on top of 86b. And these latter said they did the whole thing. We just came and we didn't testify to kill him, and so we didn't know that in the end there was going to be another person that he was going to do it again, and so therefore we just testified about that, and we have nothing to do with the final testimony. So the last set of witnesses, even Chizkiah admit that will get killed. So Maskef for Rav Papa Ihachi. So Rav Papa says, well, if that's the case, Eidei Mechira Nami. So in the case of the person who kidnapped somebody, also the witnesses who testified to the sale, only they should also be killed, according to Chizkiah. Litue, they should also be killed. Mitoch Sheichol and Eidei Geneva Omar, because the witnesses for the theft can claim, Al Kosabanu, we just came to give them lashes for the theft, about the kidnapping, but not for the sale. And if you want to say no, Chizkiah will be of the position that first set of witnesses would not actually get lashes. It can't be that Chizkiah says that. Let's say the witnesses who testify just for the kidnapping who were impeached. Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan, Chadom are woken, Chadom are inwoken. We have a source that Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan argue. One say they get lashes, and one say they go. They don't. And we said about this to Stayim, the Chizkiah Damar woken. Chizkiah is the one who says he get lashes. And how do we know that? Midamar Chizkiah ain't Rogim, because Chizkiah says they're not killed in those circumstances. And so for the fact that they're not killed to get lashes, because there's a concept called Lav Shenitin Lasaris Misas. If the court would kill, then we wouldn't give you lashes. The Rabbi Yochanan, because it was Rabbi Yochanan, Kilan Damar Naragid, right? Since Rabbi Yochanan would say that they're killed, they ain't looking at. So therefore, Chizkiah is of the position that they get lashes. And so if that's the case, why does he say that the person who testified to the theft is not killed? So the Gemara answers, Ilu lucky, inu echi laku. So and the Gemara concludes this question: if the people who inu lucky, that means to say if the person when they testified is not given lashes for the theft, how could the witnesses get lashes? So therefore, why wouldn't he say that the people who testified to the theft should get killed? Elam or Papa. And therefore, Papa says the Eidei Mechir about the witnesses about the sale of the person who after he kidnapped him and then he sold him. Koyamo pleading Aragin. Even Chizkiah would say he's killed. Where is there a dispute between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan? Excuse me, where is there a dispute between Chizkiah and the Rabbanan? The Gemara says the dispute is Kipliki be'edei Geneva, only about the first set of witnesses, the witnesses to the theft. Chizkiah Amar ein harag, and Chizkiah says they're not executed. Why? Because Geneva l'chuda kaima u'mechir l'chuda kaima, because he says they're two separate entities, and so therefore they're not killed. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan Amar Naragin, they're going to be executed because Geneva Schalta de Mechirahu, the testimony to the theft is really the beginning of the testimony to the sale. But he does testify that the people, but Rabbi Yochanan would admit that in the case of the Ben Saramar, the rebellious child, then those first set of witnesses are not killed. Well, they could just claim we just came to give the lashes. It's not one long continuum in that case. They're two totally separate things. Rabbi Yochanan would admit that. It's really a bit of a question because that's based upon a verse because it says you first need to rebuke him. So it's a separate act. Amar Abai. So now Abai teaches us way to remember all this. I call Modim Ben Saramora. If I call Modim Ben Saramora, Machokes Ben Saramora. Abai says the way to remember this is everybody agrees by Ben Saramora, by rebellious child. Everybody agrees by rebellious child, and there's a dispute by rebellious child. What does this mean? I call Modim Ben Saramora. Everybody agrees by the rebellious child, by Adam, Harishon, by the first set of witnesses, Shehin Neragin, that they're not killed. They could just say we just came to give lashes. And everybody agrees by the Ben Saramor, by the latter set of witnesses, that they are killed. Even Chizkiah would say that because about the first set, we could say they just came to give lashes. And so therefore it's complete testimony. Where's the dispute? Ben Saramora. Where's the dispute? Where Shnaim Omer Bifanenu Ganav, Shnaim Omer Bifanenu Achal. So where is there a dispute? Where two, in order for the Ben Saramor to be liable, he has to have stolen the meat and eaten the meat. So two witnesses testify to the theft, and two witnesses testify to the consumption. So Chizkiah would say they don't get impeached because they just gave half of the testimony. Whereas the Rabbanan would say that they would get killed because even on half of the testimony. Amar Rav Asi Eidei Mechira B'Nefesh Shehuzmu Ein Neragin. So Rav Asi says two witnesses that testify to the sale who were then impeached. Two witnesses who testify to the sale who are then impeached are not killed. Why? Even though we just said that they are, he says they're not. Mitoch Sheichol Omar Avdi Macharti, meaning to say, in this case, there's no evidence to the theft. They just say, I came along and say that I saw you sell this slave. He could have always claimed it was my slave that I sold. So since when they testified, there was no evidence that it was a stolen slave, they are not going to be killed if they're impeached. Amar Rav Yosef, Kaman Ozla Hashmaita de Rav Asi. So Rav Yosef says, this teaching of Rav Asi, who is it like? It's like Rabbi Akiva, who says, Davar v'lo chatzi davar. He says, you need to give the entire testimony, and they're only giving half. And Bai says, what are you talking about? He says to his Rebbe, no, it doesn't make sense to what you're arguing. The Ikar Rabbanan Aragan, even the Rabbanan who say even on a half a testimony, they wouldn't say you're killed in this place. Hamitol Kamar. It's not that it's just half a testimony. It's because they could argue there is no evidence that this person was not his slave. Elafiu Tema Rabbanan. This position of Ravasi even goes according to the Rabbanan, and we're talking about a case below also Eidei Geneva, where the witnesses to the theft did not actually arrive. And so therefore, that's why everybody says that the false witnesses to the sale are not killed. So the Gemara says, well, that's obviously the case. If you haven't established that it was a stolen slave, if you haven't established, Jeff, you have this on your head? Oh, yeah, you do. I couldn't see it. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know why. It so blends in so beautifully. So if that's the case, what's the chiddush? So the Gemara says, no. So even though after the fact the witnesses to the theft came along and proved that it was a stolen slave that they testified, they still wouldn't be executed. So Gemara says, still, it's not even a chiddush. It's obvious at the moment that they sold it, that they testified about the theft, there was no evidence that it was a stolen slave. Excuse me, at the moment that they testified to the sale, there's no evidence that it was stolen. Gemara says, no, it's Tzricha to come aram they muzay. No, we see that they are, like we saw that they were in cahoots. They didn't testify about that it was stolen, but we saw that the first set of witnesses were like hinting to the second set. So Ma'adatema Ramiza Milsa, he might have said, well, that's sufficient to say that when they testified, they really had this all in mind. We see hinting in this specific case. Other places in Shas, hinting is something, but here we say that's not enough to say that they're liable for death. So now we come up to one of my favorite topics in the Shas, which is called the rebellious elder, Zakein Mamre, the rebellious elder, Alpi Bezdin. Rebellious elder is executed. So rebellious elder gets strangulation. So who is the rebellious elder? He rebels against the decision of the court. As it says, and you have to go up. If you don't know halacha, you go up to have it decided by the central courts. So there were 3 central courts in Jerusalem. One was at the entrance to the Temple Mount. One was at the entrance to the courtyard of the temple. And one was in the Lishkas Agazes, which is the hewn chamber, which was partially in the courtyard. Ban was there. So if you have a question, come to this. So if they have the local court has a question, and then the elder and his local court, they come to this court, Shal Pesach Harbais. That was at the entrance to the Temple Mount. You say, this is what I taught, this is what my colleagues taught. This is what I taught, and this is what my friends taught, the other colleagues. Im Shamu, if he listens to them, Amar Lahem, then the court will say to them, Vim Lav, if he doesn't accept it, then they go up to they appeal to the court at the entrance to the courtyard. So if they listen, then fine. Otherwise, they appeal to the central court. When the Lishkas Hagazes Torah goes out from there to all of Israel, as it says, so then at that point, once the central court gives its ruling, he has to obey it. If he goes back to his city, if he goes back and he continues to teach just like he taught before, like his manner of studying it, that's going to be, he's exempt. He's not liable for death under those circumstances. When is he liable? He could say, listen, I think I'm right, but this is I'm just teaching it, then he's not liable for death. But if he gives a ruling that this is how you have to act in contradiction to the central teaching, to the teaching of the Bezdin Hagadol, then he's liable for strangulation, as it says, "Va'isha sher yaseh bezadon," and the verse means, "Eno hayav ad sheyoro asos." And now it says the Mishnah, so he's only liable once he gives a psak that that's have to act. Talmud shehoro asos pater. But if there's a student who gives a ruling to teach and to act in this way, he's going to be exempt. She'eno nimtza chamuro chumro kuo. His stringency is a leniency because he's not supposed to be teaching. It's a stringency that he's not allowed to give halachic rulings. She says, what does that mean? You're not allowed to rely on his rulings. The Torah says you're only liable if you're an expert. But here Rashi says, Talmud shlegilu harav nechak al bezin shebiru ubo bezin agalav v'shol chazer liiro v'hora kibitchilas pater, because you're not supposed to rely on it. Hold on one thing. I'm looking for a quote from Rashi. So, that what are we referring to? We're referring to here. The Gemara says in Sota that this is somebody who's less than 40 years old, because up until 40, you're not allowed to be a teacher of Torah, not allowed to give halach rulings. You're allowed to teach, but not allowed to give halach rulings. All right, we'll stop here, but I want to say a word about the schedule. Baruch Hashem,